I suppose looking at the report and obviously the map, the famous or infamous map at page 27, pointing out areas where identified as areas draining to water bodies that have met or exceeded the criteria specified by the Commission under Article 12 and therefore require additional measures. And looking at the 2022 derogation herd locations, which is also very helpfully contained in the EPA report. There's a discrepancy in some areas, particularly I suppose in Clare, Kerry and Leitrim. The areas identified as requiring additional measures in Clare is basically North East Clare and I suppose North and East Clare as well, perhaps unsurprisingly. Whereas most of there's no particular concentration of derogation herd locations there. In fact, if there is a concentration, it's elsewhere. Likewise, in Kerry, the big concentration in derogation herd locations is, I suppose, unsurprisingly, up in the very north part of Kerry, whereas the area requiring additional measures is South Kerry, and Leitrim looks to me to have maybe one derogation herd from the map, whereas all of Leitrim, or almost all of Leitrim, seems to be included in the areas requiring additional measures. Now, I suppose one thing that North East Clare and Leitrim have in common is a huge amount of forestry, in particular monoculture Sitka spruce forestry, much of it in the ownership of the state through Coillte. And I suppose I worry that while agriculture undoubtedly has played a part in the degradation of our water quality and undoubtedly has to act to counter that, I mean, I think it would be disingenuous to claim otherwise. But many other actors have to have a role, and a very important role to play as well. And if they don't play a role, well, we're going to be back here in 3 years' time with the Commission saying, well, really isn't much of an improvement in your water quality. And agriculture will take, because I mean, there is a zeitgeist out there of, like, drug dealers maybe get a better play in the media now than farmers, in terms of how they're being portrayed. And it is that's not to say that farmers don't have an important role to play and don't have to take action. They absolutely do. But it's broader than that. So I want to know, on the other side of the house, your house, your department, what's going to happen with regard to forestry practices? In particular, I suppose, forestry practices generally, but in particular, forestry that you effectively own. I mean, the state owns Coillte and they own vast tracts of land there. And I mean, their practice of continuing with this Sitka spruce plantations, and in particular the clear felling of them and the environmental havoc that causes. Are there any plans to do anything? I mean, is the only response to the degradation of water quality you'd introduced the derogation, we've lost the derogation. And I'm not into this blame game thing, but we all have to act.
I think in terms of, there's a role and responsibility for all sectors, obviously nitrates is primarily an agricultural issue. Phosphorus is primarily an urban waste issue, in terms of the contribution to what it's doing to water quality. And also then, we have to be careful in relation to how we manage our forestry as well, in terms of, and that's, our new forestry plan and programme which we've just put in is very much conscious of that, in terms of buffers being in place, also in terms of mix of trees, mix of broadleaves versus Sitka spruce and conifers, which is important to have the right balance and to have both. So I would agree. I think we have to ensure all potential impacts on water quality. Deputy McNamara people have full awareness of it and take full mitigation measures as well to make sure that water quality isn't impacted.
Do any of your officials have anything to?
Yeah, so I think just to add to that, I think it would be incorrect if it's in any way suggested our presentation that, the reduction in derogation or removal of derogation will solve water quality issues. It won't, just to be clear on that. And I suppose it's quite a complicated area, and it was alluded to in early deputies' interventions in terms of the reality of soil type, how management practices are applied, and intensity and different types are all have to be taken into account. So under that agricultural catchment programme we talk about, there are 2 sites, for example, in Wexford, 5 or 6 miles apart. One is a very free draining, not heavily stocked in terms of irrigation farming, and it has a much higher nitrate level than the other, which is quite intensively farmed from a derogation point of view, livestock, and that's soil type predominantly as driving that. So it's not as simple as suggesting, well, single sweep of the pen can resolve this. It's around the right action and the right measure in the right place. And that's the evolution that I suppose under the Minister's direction our policy has tried to deal with, which is using the likes of the water quality mapping and, as you say, the useful mapping. So for example, on page 21 you have the targeted agriculture measured map, which identifies, well, look at what's nitrogen, where's the nitrogen pressure arising and where's the phosphorus pressure arising. So for example, applicants under agri-environment scheme, the entry is prioritised based on water quality. The actions that they take are determined by delivery of the objectives of water quality, and the integration of the department's, I suppose, policy with the knowledge that we have, whether it's from EPA mapping, water quality, etc., and all sectors, livestock sector, arable sectors, forestry, etc., all have to contribute, as the Minister has said, in terms of that achievement, based on right action in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, sorry, Mr. Massey, did you want to add anything before I come back?
No, I would just reiterate Bill's point, and I'd refer you to that targeted agricultural measures map, where you can see in a lot of those areas the problem relates to phosphorus or sediment. And the reason why those areas have failed the Commission test is because the water quality failed to meet the parameters set down by the Commission. That's nothing to do with the presence of derogation farmers in those locations.
So, but I think if I could go back to what the Minister said, Minister, you linked phosphorus emissions to urban waste. But I mean, if you look at certainly Clare, there isn't an apparent correlation, anyway to me, between urban centres and phosphorus sediment. The big urban centres in Clare would be Ennis and obviously the Fergus drains southwards towards the Shannon estuary, and South Clare, I mean, you have Shannon, 6 Mile Bridge, being I think the second and third biggest town now. Whereas the map would indicate otherwise, it's up around North Clare, and that is an area where there's a lot of forestry. And I mean, there's been a huge degradation in the grainy catchment area, which, I mean, there is agriculture in it, certainly there's agriculture in it, but wouldn't be an area of intensive agriculture by any stretch, nor is it an area of any, I mean, Scariff is at the end of it, and that would be the only big settlement, I think, actually on the river. And I'm not hearing anything from you about any plans to do anything in forestry, and that's my question. I mean, that's not to say that I keep coming back. I'm not saying farmers don't have a role to play, agriculture doesn't have a role to play, it does. But, we really have to look at there's these hugely ambitious forest targets in Ireland, which I just can't see how they're going to be met. And yet, it's of a type of forest practice that it appears to me to be environmentally disadvantageous. And it's reflected not just in, there's a loss of biodiversity, there's all of that, but we're not here to discuss that. But there's an impact on our water quality and our water table. And I just wonder, is there a plan to address that? And what is that plan?
So just to give you a sense, the EPA have modelled out where the catchment pressures are arising, and that's disaggregated, whether it's, let's say, agriculture as the main driver. It's not exclusively agriculture, but as the main driver. Forestry as a main driver. I don't have the figures. These are questions really for the EPA in terms of it, but top of my head, my understanding, look, it's around 60% in terms of the catchments impacted primarily by agriculture. I think it's 15 or 16% in terms of forestry, and then you have urban wastewater, etc., which make up residues, etc. So there is a disaggregation at national level in terms of what's generating the greatest pressure for the water body locally, okay? It's not correct. Now, I'm not an expert on the forestry side to say there is no actions in terms of those, because the requirements in terms of appropriate assessment, the need in terms of planting of forestry, etc., all must take account of issues that you talk about and how to minimise the loading from the likes of forestry. However, in the context of today's discussion, in particular around that derogation, the 220, etc., I just would be careful that a suggestion that forestry is a major issue as opposed to livestock in those areas where derogation farming, because you've said it yourself, the map represents where derogation farming is happening. I don't have the forestry figures, but they don't align particularly closely in terms of the level of activity of the pair,
Yeah, but it's certainly, I mean, the level of either derogation farming or even intensive farming in the parts of Clare that are identified as requiring remediation and water quality, there's no correlation. I don't know Leitrim as well, but I'd be surprised. I mean, I'd say there's a lot less intensive farming. I'm open to correction, Minister, you're a lot closer to Leitrim than I am, but I'd say there's a lot less intensive farming going on in Leitrim than there is in the Golden Vale. I mean, I think that's a fair comment, and yet almost all of Leitrim is in the map. So, I think we do need to look at, and I mean, even this whole, and I don't want to mention the war, but all this stuff about, Coillte engaging with private capital funds to buy land and try to buy existing forestry, but it's all that Sitka spruce monoculture forestry that is having, I mean, if you walk across, I mean, I offered to bring Minister Pippa Hackett several times, and you're welcome to come yourself. I don't think it gets better as time goes on. But I mean, if you look at some of the forestry practices of Coillte on Slievopti, it's appalling. It really is. I mean, so for the state to be telling farmers that they have to make these sacrifices, and they do have to make the sacrifices. I'm not arguing that, but not for huge state actors to be getting away with murder environmentally, on the other hand, is sickening for farmers. And it's very hard for them to see. It's particularly hard for farmers around where I live in North East Clare, because they see what Coillte do. They see what they're up to. And they see that Coillte really deadlines on spraying, all sorts of environmental regulations. Coillte are above it because the National Parks and Wildlife Service really don't want to know, because they really don't want to get, take on a farmer, you'll get a result. Take on Coillte and you'll get bogged down in paperwork for months. That's the attitude within the National Parks and Wildlife Service.
Look, I mean, I think the reality is, Deputy McNamara, that Coillte have been leading out in relation to the change of approach in relation to national forestry. And there's no doubt, if you go back 20, 30, 40 years, the way we do forestry is very, very different now.
It's not, though.
It's about the right tree in the right place. And there's no doubt that if you go back, trees were being planted in places that weren't appropriate. And it would have been very much monocultural, and indeed in terms of buffer zones, and that wouldn't bear any resemblance either to what we have in place now. Coillte have been to the forefront of changing that in relation to the blend of deciduous broadleaf trees versus conifers. Our new forestry programme now as well has a 50-50 requirement in relation to broadleafs versus conifers as well. But you do need that mix, because I mean both of them have a very strong role to play in relation to building our timber industry. So we do need that wood if we're going to displace higher carbon inputs into housing and into building, and to use wood instead. If we're going to be able to use wood in building and reduce our need for concrete, for example, then we need to have the trees growing to do that and to replenish them. And also then in terms of continuous cover as well, that's a key part of our new forestry programme too. So listen, like with every aspect of life and the economy, what we know now is a million miles ahead of what we've known 20, 30, 40 years ago. And therefore the approaches we're taking are entirely different as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Coillte are better at PR now around it, but I'm not sure that the actual change in practice is as profound as you portray. But I accept that they're at least talking the talk at this stage. But I suppose maybe you might come back to us with what concrete changes there will be in forestry generally and Coillte in particular in these areas, in areas that have been identified as under pressure because of forestry. And I appreciate that you didn't come prepared for that particular question, but you might maybe give us a reply in writing. Is that?
I'll certainly get you an update on those very points, Deputy McNamara. And as I say, I mean, Coillte are leading out in relation to the changes and the different approach to forestry we're taking. And our new forestry programme isn't entirely different from the forestry programmes that have been in place 20 plus years ago.
Well, I hope you're right.
Well,